Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. We have finished, finally, our American election series, and so we're going to be talking about something, well, not completely unrelated. This is the first episode in our new series on the history of bad ideas, and today I'm talking to the historian of ideas, Sophie Scott-Brown, about the silent majority. Sophie, we're going to talk about a concept, the silent majority, which has a very interesting history, and we're going to get into that. It has tended to be associated with certain politicians. So one of them is Richard Nixon, and we will also talk about that. But I feel like I have to start just by time-stamping this podcast. We are recording it afternoon UK time, morning US time where you are, on the 5th of November, 2024. Let's properly timestamp it, which is Election Day. And another politician who has tried to use this phrase is Donald Trump. So I just had a look to see what he said recently. And the latest example I've got is 7 hours ago. So that is late last night. Pretty much the last thing he said on the campaign trail was, the silent majority is back, and tomorrow you have to get out and vote. This level of enthusiasm is 5 times greater than theirs. Which in itself is quite an interesting take on what's so weird about that phrase, because if they're silent, how come their enthusiasm is 5 times greater than theirs? What's so interesting about this phrase, and we are doing this as part of a series about bad ideas, not because these are terrible ideas or wicked ideas, but because these are ideas that have a currency, they have a purchase, and they get used and abused. And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which this idea can be abused. But at the heart of it is this puzzle, which is it's about silence, but it's also got a political concept in it, the majority. And the majority in politics is an active force in some form or another. And then the puzzle is always, if we really are talking about silence, we're probably talking about something that is behind politics and doesn't manifest itself. And yet the political uses of this term are all about, in Trump's example, mobilizing the silent majority. He's almost saying, you're so silent, we can hear you screaming. So that's part of the puzzle here. So that's part of what we're going to unpack. But we want to do the history of this idea. This is the history of it. And it has an interesting and rich history. And one of the things I didn't know about it, so when I was reading up a bit on it, is that it was used quite extensively in the 19th century. It also has some classical origins, but it wasn't primarily used in a political sense. That the commonest use of it in the 19th century, the phrase the silent majority, was to refer to the dead. And the idea was that people would pass over or go to join the silent majority because the majority of all the human beings who have ever lived are now silenced, which is actually a really beautiful idea, the non-political use of it. I find it an incredibly evocative idea, but what's appealing about it is, to me, the implication that here we are living our lives on Earth. It's all noise. It's all frenetic. But for all of us, there will come a point where we simply go. We join the silent majority, and it's real silence. It's not get out and vote. You're dead, so get out and vote. It's all the noise is here and now, but there is a deeper silence, which is the silence of eternity or whatever it is. And in some ways, it's almost the opposite of the way the term is used by politicians. I don't know what you feel about it, but I actually, when I read it, got a little chill from it in a good way.
Comes from the Roman orator Petronius, who writes something along the lines of he has gone to join the many or something like that. And then it continues as a euphemism for the dead, consequently. It is lovely, and there is a poetry to it, but actually I wouldn't see it as quite so separate from a sort of political history as well. Now, we're used to its use, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this in some detail, among the kind of neoconservative right. But actually, the idea that there's something straight away, the idea of the dead has a sort of authority with it because it's a fact. It's a sort of strength of numbers, and it's not too far. I don't think you'd be taking too many steps away to say that there's something in there about the kind of authority of inevitability and the inescapability of history, and how even though the dead are gone, they're coming with us. And of course, that's actually quite a strong and active idea in other forms of maybe more traditional notions of conservatism. And this notion that the silent majority here is the weight of history. and that what you're doing when you invoke the silent majority is saying, well, we are carrying forward, we're carrying onwards with tradition, with history, and what have you. But of course, that's still very much dealing with the majority that's not with us. There is another account of it, again, in a different form of conservatism that we might associate more with Hobbes, the living silent majority, who are enthralled to the state of nature, for example, and therefore they're silent because they're ignorant. They don't know any better. And actually, there's a case to be made that your authority or your leadership are those very tiny elites who do understand power, who do understand how to rule. So the silent majority there is almost infantilized, is childlike. It's a rationale for your power, but it's not yet the kind of manipulative or the wheedling tone that we're hearing today about, sort of trying to mobilize a silent majority. It's just justifying why you're acting upon them rather than with them.
Yeah, and I was thinking that 19th century idea of the dead, of course, there is a form of small c conservatism, which goes back well before the 19th century, and Edmund Burke and other people, where the job of the living, the ones who happen to be alive now, in a way, it's to bridge two silent majorities. And I don't think it's used for the other one, but it could be. There are the dead and the unborn. So politics exists in a space between the unborn, who are the ultimate children, they haven't even arrived yet, and literally have no voice because they don't exist, but they can be conceived as a force in politics. You do things for the unborn and those who have already gone, and you have obligations there too, and you get a form of conservative politics in which the job of the politician is to be the bridge between the two. But as you say, there is still a big difference between people who, for different reasons, are literally silenced, have no voice, death, unborn, and those who are alive, but for whatever reason can't speak for themselves. And from the 19th to the 20th century does seem like it's the move from those earlier small c conservative versions of the silent majority to something much more active, in which the claim is made, it is staked to be the person who can articulate things that these people would say for themselves if only someone was listening. And that seems to be the difference. Is that the difference here, do you think, that in the 20th century you get these versions, certainly, as you say, on the big C conservative or neoconservative right, where the job of the politician is not to bridge various generations that have gone or are yet to come, but articulate for people not who are, in the Hobbesian sense, completely inarticulate, but have been silenced. There's that feeling that the politician is speaking for people whom someone else has silenced.
I think you're exactly right in how you frame the difference as it plays out in the 20th century. But I actually think, I'm just going to claw my way back into the 19th for a moment yet. I think that still has its origins in that space. And yet, possibly, we're not quite at the point where we're using the specific phrase silent majority, but a lot of the notions and the concepts behind it, particularly those you're describing, I think we can sort of examine actually not on the right, but more on the left. I mean, in some senses, I'd argue that your ultimate silent majority theorist is Marx, in the sense that silence and majority are actually quite crucial to his thinking in two senses. Firstly, the silence isn't because the masses are infantile and simply not by nature born to lead and therefore need to be led. They are silenced because they're oppressed and they're exploited. And that is done sort of to them, but it's also produced between and among them, the experience, the alienation of capitalism. But nevertheless, should that spell be broken, and should that silence, I should say, be broken, and should someone, Marx, be able to articulate that to people, then you suddenly have the capacity to come to consciousness, to realize that you're unified not just as a group, but as the largest group, the majority group, which makes you, therefore, not just a powerful force, but a historically powerful force, in the sense that you can literally change the structure of history in terms of power distribution. So I think a lot of that idea, the idea that my job as a politician is not simply to continue on with this sort of natural law or this historical precedence of tradition, but to actually intervene and articulate, perhaps still on behalf of a historical process, but nevertheless not one that's going to be organic or inevitable, one that needs some degree of intervention to, well, this is a riddle that's never been solved about Marxism, quite what the degree of human agency is, but presumably you're going to speed this process up or you're going to aid it along in some way. Nevertheless, this idea that your primary job as a political ruler is to articulate the will of the people rather than articulate the will of the people to them, you're articulating it for them. I think that owes very much to the left. But I think there's also some nuances you can get from different kinds of thinkers too. In a different way, this idea, still sort of broadly speaking on the left or certainly on the liberal side of things, you've got an element of this idea in someone like Bentham, the idea that, again, actually silence is actually a political comment. It's approval or contentment. And actually, you want to aim for the silent majority because that means for the most part, people are okay. They're contented. They express themselves when they're in pain. So therefore, I think this is a bit of a crude simplification of Bentham, but I think broadly speaking, he believes we should be administrating for the majority and that we'll know we're doing a good job when they're not complaining about it. But then you have a very different account of that from someone like J.S. Mill, who, for him, both silent and majority are completely the opposite. They're both actually bad things. Silence produces majorities because actually it's speaking, which is the stuff of democracy, if you like. Speaking is what reveals us all to be all noisy minorities, not majorities at all. And that if you allow silence and you allow majority, you allow tyranny. So I think this idea is doing an awful lot of complicated legwork in the 19th century, all of which arrives ready to play out in the 20th century.
That's really interesting. So there are three, as I hear you, there are three different things going on there. And with all uses of the literal term or the broader concept, even if people don't articulate it as a silent majority, the central puzzle is the relationship between silence and majority, and silence which sounds passive and majority which sounds active. So one of the ways in which that puzzle can be resolved, which you said is the Marx way, but it's weirdly, I think, what Marx has in common with Richard Nixon, not a phrase you hear very often, which is the idea that the key consciousness raising that the politician has to do is to let the silent people know that they are a majority, because they may well be unaware how many people there are like them because they are silent. Noisy minorities often give the impression, and we'll come on to how this plays out on social media or anywhere else, but noisy minorities often give the impression that there are many more of them than there actually are because they're making all the noise. And I think Nixon, in his use of it in 1969, is making a similar point, which is he's trying to say to Americans who, in his case, he thinks are the ones who are alienated and horrified by the noise that's being made by the left around Vietnam, the protests, the hippies, the counterculture, the drug takers, the long-haired, whatever. These people are relatively isolated from each other. They are in rural communities, they're in small-town communities. The noisy people are on the steps of the Capitol in Washington. They're on the front of the New York Times. And his job as a politician is to let people who are disconnected from each other know that they are the majority, which is sort of what Marx is saying to the proletariat. If you are alienated as a member of the proletariat, your life is so shrunken by your circumstances, the day-to-day struggle to survive, it's very easy to forget that you nonetheless belong to a very powerful majority. And if you can access or articulate that power, you will become the master of your fate. And that's so different from those other two versions, the Bentham version and the Mill version. The Bentham version, which is silence is a mark of contentment, and the Mill version, which is that majoritarianism is a mark of sheepish, crowd-like conformism, and the job is to break those things up. What's so interesting to me is that the conservative politicians who are using it, and I would include Trump in this, in the 21st century, are more like Marx than they are like the other two. Is that fair? Do you think that's the one that gives it the real purchase in contemporary democratic politics? Trump is saying, this was not meant to all be about Trump, but sod it. Today of all days, I've been thinking about him for 10 years. I can't stop today. Trump is saying to people, you think because of the way the media is brainwashing you, that you are the isolated minorities, but your enthusiasm is 5 times greater than theirs. You are the ones, if you could just see it, you are the ones through me who are connected into this big majority. It's a little bit like, of those 3 19th century versions, of the 3, the Marxist one. He's not saying you're the silent majority because you're so content with Joe Biden's administration. And he's not saying don't be the silent majority because it's much better that you aren't a majority at all.
Oh, Oh, that's a really interesting, that's a very provocative idea. I think I'm going to start at it. I'm going to hedge my bets and head back to Nixon for a moment there, and then I'll build up to Donald Trump. But I mean, what Nixon does when he first puts that specific phrase, I mean, he wasn't the first. It gets another sort of miniature outing with Calvin Coolidge, who was in 1919, and I believe in the run up to the 1920 presidential election, another Republican. Interesting thing about Calvin Coolidge, notorious for being a very silent man, and therefore famous for saying something along the lines of, the American people want a solemn ass for their president, I am happy to oblige, or something along those lines. So there'd been a little outing for it earlier, again in a conservative setting, and again already shifting that relationship, as you mentioned, away from this sort of conservative inherent sense of entitlement or natural right to lead and rule and articulate for majorities that may or may not be present with us or not. And actually increasingly, especially in this American context, already thinking of being far more a tense but much more negotiated endowing of power from the people to the leadership, even though that's sort of very contradictory and fringed with tension, especially from a sort of right perspective. Now, Nixon, I think, uses that phrase, and I see it as a really shrewd rhetorical double move in a sense. In some sense, I think you're completely right. He is, oddly enough, reclaiming territory that's been traditionally left wing. And he's doing this at a point, 1969, where the sort of post war left are in a certain degree of turmoil amongst themselves, and especially around the issue of what their relationship to the people, broadly speaking, are. I mean, the notion of class and the category of class has really sort of come under fire, particularly when it ceases to be plausible just to refer to the working classes as an industrial working class. So he's coming into the traditional territory of the left and particularly claiming that prerogative of the representative relationship to the people. At the same time, I think with Nixon, there still is a large degree to which he's actually warning against, I'm not sure it's contentment exactly, but certainly complacency. Like there's this degree to which he's still invoking that sense of, well, you know that I represent, broadly speaking, your interests, but you can't be complacent that the noisy minorities will remain a minority. If they've got so much energy, and you don't do anything, you can't be complacent about this. Now, I think Trump is doing something quite different. I think this is quite a new phenomenon again, that he's sort of the attempt to mobilize the silent majority. I mean, it's incredibly sort of contradictory on so many levels. But yeah, I think you're quite right. It's certainly not a contentment thing. I don't think he's saying you can't be complacent that your interests will be continue to be represented, because obviously in his view they haven't been for the past 4 years, unless possibly there's a degree to which he's using this phrase by saying, look, you were complacent last time and look what happened. So now if you want to protect your best interests, you have to be more active, and then you can go back to being complacent because I will take care of you.
And it is also true that when he talks about the silent majority on, well, it used to be Twitter, now he does it on Truth Social, it's all caps. And it's very weird, actually, seeing the phrase silent majority all capitalized, because shouted at you, because it looks really odd. It's almost like it messes with your head, which of course he is very skilled at doing. So there are all these different things going on in the phrase. It has a long history, a literal history of the phrase itself, and then uses of it to capture the same idea. What do you think it was about Nixon's use of it in 1969 that kind of propelled it into the political lexicon in a way it didn't exist before? So there is a shift in the use of that phrase pre-1969, whereas, as you say, it did crop up. Silent Cal and other people used it. It became associated with him. It became one of his catchphrases for Nixon, the silent majority. And it does seem to have had a particular purchase at a time of, as now, deep partisanship in American politics, but also a kind of visibility for certain kinds of minorities. So the ones that he was talking about were explicitly anti-Vietnam War protesters, but then he was trying to touch base with the range of things that the silent majority might not like about them, including their hair, including in many cases their race. That no question this phrase plays on the thought that the silent majority, one of the things Nixon would be wanting to say to them without spelling it out to remember is you're all white or almost all white, not necessarily all, but almost all. but it did seem to have a real kick to it in the late 60s. So do you think that is about not just noise, but it mixes the metaphors a bit, but visibility, in the sense that news and the coverage of news and the way that news was presented and projected to the majority of Americans was dominated by people who didn't look like or resemble them? Because it's very hard in politics to know which phrases actually worked in the sense of mobilizing the electorate. But this one certainly feels like it resonated at that time.
I think that's a really key choice of word, the resonance. And I think actually it works very ironically, because actually what's going on is the sort of discovery of just how problematic both the notion of majority is, but also with the concept of silent majority, I think is referring to the increasing intense feeling of exclusion from a political process. And that actually being not just belonging to certain minority groups, but actually there's never been before such a strong sense of a gulf between the political classes and the very rapid shifts and changes that people are experiencing among themselves. So, in some sense, it's an attempt to articulate a very turbulent, very vociferous political atmosphere. And ironically, doing that by continually to invoke that. And again, that's almost going back to the dead, isn't it? It's that sort of powerful authority. We are the largest group, therefore we carry with us the authority of history or the authority of natural right or whatever it may be. And yet the reality of that being the absolute opposite. Because the reality is that it is a period which is sort of fragmenting everywhere at every possible dimension into these lots of smaller minorities. And then even as you sort of progress on into the more sort of neoliberal era of 80s, 90s and what have you, those majorities are reducing down and down and down and down to increasingly just very angry, very isolated feeling individuals. So I think there's a huge irony that the phrase resurges in popularity at the very time when people have never been less sure what or who the majority are and what kind of relationship to the political class's silence brings with it. And the other interesting thing about that time, so we're talking about minorities, noisy minorities, but actually a lot of those noisy minorities are not that minor at this point. I mean, the concept of silent majority has been really useful for groups like women or for colonized subjects or people of color. Now, actually, are they minorities? I mean, women, that's a very enormous group of people. And the idea of silence there is starting to think about, as I say, to what degree does the political process, it's not even the extent to which it recognizes my existence, but the extent to which we're talking about a system which, because it hasn't recognized women and the differences between women, because it's been taking a sort of universal white man as its sort of standard imaginative model for so long, it's not that I don't even get a chance to participate in this process. It's that it doesn't recognize me and therefore it doesn't capture my experience in life. So it's actually, this silence has multiple layers to it. It's not just about allowing access to women into politics. It's about a kind of politics that is simply not responding to female experience or to the experience of people of color or to the experience of colonized subjects. So yeah, I think we're ironically rediscovering silent majority just at the point where actually we're finding the relationship between politics and the people has never been more fractured and strained and incomprehensible.
It is very striking that in 1969, Nixon takes over that phrase. And as you say, in some ways, there is a more obvious silent majority, which is women. So women are not disenfranchised in a literal sense. They were literally disenfranchised not that long earlier, like a couple of generations earlier in the United States. There are other majorities, parts of the United States, where a majority of the population would be non-white. And in the 1960s, 69, you're only a few years out from that group having been disenfranchised. And yet it is not those groups who use this phrase. I don't think the phrase silent majority has had ever much traction in feminist thought. And it seems to me the reason why is that the implication of the phrase and what Nixon is doing with it is to insist that because of the silence, this group of people require representation by someone or something that can speak for them. It's not, certainly in Nixon's case, it is not a call for the silent majority themselves to storm the barricades. It is to empower him to defend them. which is not the mood of late 1960s feminism. Women have had enough of having other people speak for them. Their entire political history has been to be represented, and the drive, including the personalization of politics, is for self-actualization, self-representation. And therefore, the phrase silent majority doesn't seem to fit. So that seems to be one of the ways in which Nixon was able to co-opt it. And then the other thing that is interesting about the phrase is there is another very well-known political phrase associated with the majority, which is the tyranny of the majority. So we've got the silence of the majority and the tyranny of the majority. These things seem to be, which they are, at odds with each other. The tyranny of the majority, a classic liberal 19th century phrase, suggests that the danger in politics, and Mill would share this view, he wants to break the majority up. The danger in politics is that the majority will stifle with its conformity and its groupthink and will be prey to populist politicians. And therefore you need checks and balances and barriers in the way of the tyrannical majority. By the time you get late 20th century, mid-late 20th century, almost by implication, politicians like Nixon are saying the tyranny of the majority is not the problem anymore. The majority has been silenced by all of these checks, and it's been silenced by having liberal elites speak for it and refuse to allow it to articulate its collective view. And we need to get back to a form of politics that is not frightened of the majority view. We're no longer in an age where the fear is that the majority will expropriate the rich and abolish all debt. The fear of the present age is that the majority will be silenced by minorities who want to expropriate the rich and abolish debt, liberal, educated, Ivy League, communist elites. And so by over 100 years, the two ideas get turned on their head. And the Mill one has been frozen out, almost because Nixon is saying it's been too successful. You've let John Stuart Mill type lefty elitists rule us for too long.
I think actually this is a tension that's sort of writhing. It's ideologically pluralist. I think it's embedded on both right and left. So, for example, you're absolutely right, women don't want to be spoken for. And yet, even if the phrase perhaps isn't so readily used, there is still a notion drawn to a degree from Marxist borrowings, the idea that in order to change anything, we're going to need to unify as a group. Therefore, we're going to need to articulate some kind of collective experience. I mean, in some senses, that's not unique to the feminist movement. That's in the Black Power movement, that you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. We're going to have to be a unified group in order to challenge the other unified groups that currently hold more power than we do. And then that's where the silent majority becomes a very important playing piece. Again, it's endowing you with the authority to speak to your collective that's going to back you up in your challenge for power at the same time, and especially amongst these groups, because actually what they really want is not just to have women's experience, because obviously there is no single one women's experience recognized and turned into a political program. Actually, what they're talking about is that more Millsian, familiar, kind of fine-grained, intersectional, I think is the favored phrase, nuanced ability to engage with a range of relevant or prescient issues. There's always that fight within these so-called majorities. Actually, any sort of silent majority up close turns out to be a lot of chattering minorities. But the main difference between the right and the left is that actually the left, because it's part of the moral ethos of being on the left, that you want to respect this, particularly if you're on the liberal left, I should clarify, is that tension between wanting to respect the uniqueness and distinctness of individuals and wanting to mobilize the unity of the group in order to leverage political power. That's always a squabble. I think the interesting thing with the right, it's a slightly different one. To me, it's this weird mashup of taking that notion from essentially a borrowing from the left, or the more aggressive forms of the left, to say, right, well, we need to mobilize this silent majority, but it's still trying to invoke that more traditional sense of we have some sort of natural insight or natural right to the people, and that actually what's being suppressed is the organic voice of the people. So I think it's sort of this very strange cocktail of ideas. I suppose you could relate it back to some of the debates about natural society and artificial society. And we're back to Edmund Burke again, the idea that these chattering minorities with their clever schemes and plans actually don't really understand the natural organic process. And it's that that's in danger of collapsing under the weight of their avaricious scheming, as it were. And that's what must be defended. But at the same time, doing that in a very interventionist sense, which is obviously quite contradictory to the idea that you're trying to defend. So never let it be said the right's logical.
One of the things that liberals struggle with, I think, small L liberals, when confronted with the right's expropriation of the idea of the silent majority. And there's a good example of this. There was an article by Jamel Bowie in the New York Times in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, talking about Trump's invocation of the phrase silent majority and how he was using it and abusing it. And to say there is a silent majority in the United States, but it is not the one that Trump is referring to. It is the majority of people who belong to minorities. This is the new majority. And of course, that's not a really easy idea to hold on to, that the silent majority is the majority of minorities. That is the classic liberal notion. That's the sort of majority we want, one that can't be co-opted in this way, can't be just captured by a single leader or a single figurehead. That's the liberal dream of democracy in a way. But then the other way in which the idea can be appropriated and effectively used in contemporary politics is around elections themselves, because the other thing we associate with the phrase majority is winner, even in a system as completely insane as the American Electoral College, where not necessarily will the popular vote winner win the election, but nonetheless, state by state, majorities decide. And so there is almost a sense, less, I think, with Nixon, and he was speaking in 1969 just after he'd been elected. Trump much more in the run-up to elections, which is the way that democratic politics works means if you are a member of the silent majority, you only have to do one thing, which is to show up at the ballot box, the polling station, pull the lever, whatever it is you do, post your vote in, and we'll win. So you can be silent. You have my permission, Trump would almost say. He wants them to be noisy at his rallies, but in general, because the kind of politics we have are very passive politics, a politics so geared around elections as though democracy was just voting once every 4 years. If the silent majority just does its once every 4 years duty in the period in between, Nixon, Trump can govern in their name. And what that misses is the fact that democratic politics is so much more than just voting in elections. And there is a way of arguing about the silent majority that says actually what the phrase should be trying to capture are all the ways in which there is politics going on everywhere, but it's not being heard in this mad focus on elections, which just tends to hear a certain kind of noise. Most people's lives are political in so many ways and dimensions that are just not being heard. And so you could start thinking about an idea of democracy where, I suppose it's closer to Bentham in a way, where there is a silence which is an indication that people are willing to let the politics that happens at the top stand. But it doesn't mean that they've given up on politics, that we are all of us doing politics in a million ways which are just not being heard.
Yeah. In around about early 1980s, 1983, the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard brings out a book called In the Shadow of Silent Majorities. And what he actually does in that book is turn the whole idea about silent majority completely on its head. And he says that, okay, politicians might be using this as a sort of insignia for a tacit approval to whatever they're doing or some sort of natural right to lead. But you could look at silent majorities as a basic rejection, a critique of the political process, a basic statement that in many respects it completely fails to capture what, well, I mean, Baudrillard was making a slightly separate point. He was seeing silence as a much more active form of resisting political process, full stop, that the fact that we will not participate, we will not get excited about things, we will not talk about the debates that we are told are the debates of the day, we will not go willingly to the election polls unless we are utterly sort of whipped up into a total fury in order to do so. But that leads on to ideas that you get quite a lot in forms of thought like anarchism, which in some forms of anarchism, what you're basically doing is taking that liberal instinct into we should all be busy being very actively participant in politics, but in a much broader, wider range of ways than is currently recognized or acknowledged by the official political institutions, conventions, procedures, processes, etc. I mean, it's also linked to another idea, the unpolitical, which again has a very sort of double-edgedness to it and possibly not something to be dealt with a little bit separately. But nevertheless, the idea that the unpolitical is not a refusal of politics per se, but it's a refusal of the political game, the political system. And it's the idea that decision making, social negotiations, the busy, difficult world of living together, it's not just that it's not represented fully or the things we care about are not fully represented in the official system, but it's also that the system doesn't really have the capacity to do that because it's so busy, as you said, it's focused on winning and losing. It's very dichotomized and still quite binary. And actually, what we find when we try and live together and we try and cooperate together is it's squishy, it's messy, there are no clean answers. People have to sort of compromise in tortuous ways which do not lend themselves readily to the kind of political methods that we traditionally or conventionally look to. So I think the idea of silent majority can actually be a way of saying, right, well, we're the silent majority when it comes to the political process, because actually, for the most part, for many of us, it doesn't mean much. It doesn't really work. But the minute you are willing to look closely at the silent majority, you'll see actually we're a lot of very articulate minorities under this veneer of glacial silence.
And that, to me, is what's wrong with the phrase the silent majority. So I totally get what you're saying, which is that there is a way of looking at politics which tries to get beyond where the noise is and where the focus is, particularly modern electoral politics, and recognizes in a way that people would have done in the longer sweep of human history that much of what passes for politics doesn't touch people's lives, and much of what people most care about doesn't reach the level of conventional politics. And yet, not just Nixon and Trump, but the way in which the phrase the silent majority gets used is to take that thing, that truth, I think it's a truth, that most of life is not political in the conventional sense, and yet most of life has great importance and significance for people in a way that touches on the big political questions. It's about fairness and justice and revenge and what you're willing to fight for, all of that. But what the phrase silent majority does is it always then tries to drag that back up to the level of politics, because that phrase majority, what does it mean otherwise? I mean, it could be the silent many, the silent people, silent lives, all of that. But majority is such a political term, and it feels to me emblematic of what's wrong with democracy now, which is we are always trying to squeeze the full range of human political experience into this narrow funnel of electoral politics, winners and losers. Now, I said earlier on, I spent 10 years thinking about Trump, and it's partly because it's invaded my consciousness and shrunk it to me not really being able to think about much more than whether or not he's going to win, which is complete madness. But the phrase the silent majority, it buys into that. I think Nixon is the emblem of it, the person who worked out how to use it. And that's why I think it's a bad idea, because it is taking something which is true. For most people, Washington or Westminster or wherever style politics isn't the be all and end all of their lives. Actually, often it's really far removed from their lives and their experience. It takes that truth. It doesn't try and do a Burke small c conservative thing with it and try to talk about the rich panoply of human experience and what it would mean to convey that in a broad political philosophy. It tries to turn it into a winning electoral coalition. It almost captures where democracy has gone wrong. That's my argument for why it's a bad idea.
In some senses, this idea that we can stay silent as long as occasionally we are mobilized to do the very bare minimum taps into a wider condition of political exhaustion. And I think it has its roots in that post-war moment. I mean, obviously, I'm sitting in New York and I'm thinking a lot about the American situation, and a figure like Daniel Bell springs to mind, and the end of ideology, the exhaustion of political ideas in the 50s. And I often interpret that as not necessarily that we'd run out of ideas, but we'd certainly exhausted political ideas. And unless we were prepared to do the kind of legwork that it took to find entirely new systems of organizing and expressing the sheer complexity of late modernity or post-industrial life, where we can't rely on the stability of traditional political categories like class, for example, anymore. If we're not prepared to do that, then we are going to be left with essentially bread and circuses. To me, this election really feels very much like Halloween felt, because actually there was this sense that you all come out for a parade and that everyone's sort of dressed up and there's a license to be a bit creepy, be a bit wacky, all that sort of thing, because it's a parade. And actually, the interesting thing about Halloween is no one's talking about the back history of it and how it related to a sort of whole religious tradition or this notion of what the Day of the Dead was. No one cares. It has literally just come down to this almost routine-like feeling of, we're going to go out in the evening, we're going to dress up, we're going to take part in this without really remembering why or how, but because it's there and it's there to do. It's a complete routinization of politics. And that's fine in the sense that maybe all our hearts are elsewhere, and maybe actually we're full of, like I said, all this rich potential that we could all live in a different way, but we're not. And the fact of power is something we're not confronting here, and the silent majority helps uphold that.
Halloween is so interesting because in the UK, the thing that comes up every year is people saying, when did Halloween become a thing? And then when did it become a compulsory thing? People will often almost imply there was a conspiracy at work and no one told them, and they woke up from one year to the next, and suddenly everyone is expected, not parades in the UK, so it's not a parade-based thing, but trick-or-treating and all of that. And this year on our street, I noticed that the silent majority fought back because the convention now is you put a pumpkin out to signal that the kiddies can knock on your door. And on our street, there were very, very few pumpkins. And I thought the rebellion has finally begun. The silent majority are starting to mobilize and push back against this thing. But I think it is part of the hollowing out of politics that phrase could have so much purchase. And that's why I think it's a bad idea, just as you said. And yet there is one area in which I find myself thinking about it. Don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it feels like it has purchase, which is politics as it happens online. Because that's the other thing that is different now relative to when Nixon was doing it. Nixon was talking in an age where he was basically saying, there is one elite here, which is as Trump would call it, the fake mainstream media. I don't know how Nixon would have put it, but there is an elite which is feeding you a version of politics. And it is being dominated by these noisy people. But their noise is being mediated by this elite. You're seeing them on TV because the TV stations are choosing to show them, and they're not showing you. They're not projecting back to you your values and who you are. And there are more of you than there are of them, but the noisy people are being heard, and this technology is transmitting them into your homes. But in the age of post-digital revolution, information technology, it's different in that we all have a platform in a way. And if we want to make a lot of noise, we can. No, maybe no one will listen. There's a lot of noise online, which is just into the void, but then a lot of it is being heard. And there are little collective action posses that are formed to do this and do that. And there is vigilantism and all of that. There's a kind of Wild West quality to it. And the idea that politics, this is almost a cliched thought, but that politics is being skewed by certain kinds of noisy behavior online being amplified and projected, and people who are not taking part in that not being heard. But it doesn't feel like it's noise versus silence. I don't think many people now are silent in that respect. I mean, we're not silent in the sense that even to engage in the world of news media is to be a participant now. Our preferences are being trawled. Everyone is a player in this thing. But some people are just much quieter. And it made me think about why the phrase isn't the quiet majority. So there seems to me to be a difference between the silent majority and the quiet majority. And the silent majority is almost a contradiction in the way it's used in politics. The Trump version, all caps, silent majority. All caps, quiet majority would be still pretty weird. But online, at least, it's not that any of us have been silenced. This technology is the opposite of silencing. But my God, some people are noisier than others. And there's a sort of drowning out effect that's happening. And it is by minorities, no question. And it is an age of politics in which a certain kind of activist voice on all sides is just much louder because of the ways it can be amplified. And it doesn't have to pass through the conventional mainstream transmission media. It can find its own megaphone. And there I feel there is a sense in which I find myself thinking there probably is at least a quieter majority out there that a skillful politician, if able to tap into and mobilize, could do something with.
We spoke earlier about how silence in some way has often been used as a form of eloquence in the sense that, oh, we are all contented, or we are basically approving tacitly of what is going on. And I think sometimes actually noise, just to continue the ironic theme of this podcast, noise can also be silencing sometimes too. So in some sense, we've got such a noisy racket going on online that it's that busy marketplace allows us all to buy into the particular view that we most want to hear. And in that sense, we're not achieving any approximation of democracy. Yes, in some ways, we've got communications technologies which ought to be able to facilitate our capacity for good quality communication. And yet, so often the opposite happens because we are not allowing other people's views to interpenetrate ours, which is the essence of democracy, as someone like Mills would have understood it. The idea that you can let other people's experience and ideas infuse your own and therefore produce a new kind of way to live together. That's living the democratic dream there. But actually, what we're doing is we're seeing this multiplicity of echo chambers quite a lot. That might be a little bit too blanket, as you're saying. There's undeniably some voices penetrate louder in that online sphere than others. Why is that? Possibly their understand. I mean, we have entire very serious, very expensive MA courses devoted to how actually you do this sort of branding and marketing, how you manipulate, get these sort of meme ideas. And that actually cuts across both left and right. A lot of activist strategy, how you get that slogan, which acts as a sort of portal, magical portal, if you like, into this kind of unifying sense of you belong to us, you're one of us, you're in our group. It's still not anywhere near anything approximating democracy as a conversation. It's still approximating to that fairly crude majoritarian theory, which is, if we get the numbers over the line, we'll be the biggest gang in the playground. But certainly in some senses, you could see this as sort of, I think, ancient rhetoricians would either be horrified or they'd be impressed at how, just getting those, the reason we're here today, finding that magical slogan, which just seems to meme its way into people's minds and then sits there looking like it covers a whole multiplicity of quite different things, when in actual fact, under interrogation, it doesn't. But nevertheless, it's what people believe about it that is important. It's quite an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, and quite actually the reverse to what the original fears about mass society were, which was that difference would be so homogenized that we would be silenced that way. Whereas in actual fact, go on social media, if you can get the snappiest phrase that everyone's going to like and share, then great, you've won. But I don't think we're looking at a democratic revolution by that means.
And I think it is also true that with this phrase, it always can cash out in two ways. So there is a way of arguing, and many politicians do this. And I hate to use the phrase the culture wars, but I can just never think of another snappy, shorthand, meme phrase to capture what we're talking about here. So let's call them the culture wars. Many politicians would say that in the culture wars, there is a majority whose position is not the same as the one that is being most loudly articulated. Particularly, I think the assumption is that there are certain positions that are articulated on the left or progressive positions, and that there is a majority against those positions. So you've definitely seen this around the trans debate, that many politicians have tried to say that the view that is being most loudly articulated is very much a minority view, but the majority has been silenced. So that is one position that is sometimes taken. And that is the classic attempt to mobilize the silent majority as a force to defeat the other side. The other possibility is that the majority of people don't like the culture wars. And this view is also often articulated, that actually there is a kind of noisiness in public argument which has a tone to it and an intolerance to it, which most people don't buy into. And you don't hear the people who don't like it because they don't want to play that game. They don't want to try and meet fire with fire. And the second position, which may well be true, is one where it is much harder for politicians to mobilize that, to be the politician who speaks for the people who don't want to play that game. That is a much harder position to articulate if what you're about is forming a majority to win an election or whatever it is. So it could be that that second group is actually the silent majority here. Like with politics, most people are not playing that game in their everyday lives. And those people are not being represented particularly. More likely, those people are being turned into that other kind of silent majority, the assumption being, if we could hear what these people think, the people who don't want to play that game, actually, deep down, they disagree with the other side, the side that I'm trying to defeat. And it goes both ways. It goes on other issues on the right as well. But the more partisan or activist positions, actually, when the phrase silent majority is invoked, it's almost always to try and mobilize the coalition, not to say, what about the people who don't want to play the game? But actually, the people who don't want to play the game, that is the silent majority. And the reason the phrase doesn't work is that you can't mobilize them because they don't want to play the game.
For something like the culture wars, in one sense, what that means is that it's no longer really makes as much sense anymore to talk about divides. I mean, we are doing, because again, we haven't actually got any other useful terms, but using terms left and right as if we were referring to a stable ideological playing field is increasingly redundant these days. And yet we're sort of doing it because we have no choice, because we don't have any other vocabularies or languages that, are getting closer to the nub of what we're experiencing. So we keep using this language. And in some sense, what we're looking at is, again, the culture was a classic example of a failure of a particular mode of political reasoning, which is exactly what you're describing. My group's going to come up against your group and it's going to win because it's going to club your group over the head the hardest, and or at least it's going to claim to have the most popular support. The opposition saying, well, any support who's not actively saying they support you must be on my side, sort of thing. And in some ways, that is the entire failing of our inherited or received political logic. And it's much harder. The group that you're describing, that group that isn't saying anything because actually they just don't want to play that game. And it's not that they're not unsympathetic to this issue, but it has to be contextualized. It has to be more considered in context. Any of these issues, be it the transgender issue or any other subject, that sense of weariness of things being continually treated on this very abstract plane and very removed or detached from how people are encountering them, experiencing them in life. That's a real problem. Now, on the one hand, in some senses, someone like me can say, right, well, that silence is great. That's actually, again, using it in that Baudrillard sense of it's a form of resistance, or if it's not resistance, then in that kind of Colin Ward anarchist, well, it's not quite resistance, but it means it's a potential for other sorts of political thinking, which might be quite exciting to explore. But the problem is still coming, because in some ways silent majority is almost like a gatekeeper. And the gate swings both ways, because in some senses, by using it, on the one hand, you might go through and discover the basic failings or problems with a political system that needs rethinking. And there might be resources within those people saying, well, I don't know, I don't want to do it this way. I don't know if I have one single opinion about this issue, sort of thing. All that's very exciting. But because it's hard to know how to mobilize this against the system, which is still the fact of how we do things, it's still the way we describe things, it's still how we organize ourselves officially, it's still how we distribute and organize power in our society. And in some senses, even though it's failing us, the failure to confront it by hedging your bets with a term like silent majority means that it's licensing it to continue. So once again, we're back at silent majority being not approval, not contentment, not quite resistance, but utter lostness. And that's great, but where do you go from there?
Yeah, and I'm all for people pushing back against positions that they disagree with on all of these cultural issues. And, I have my own views on them, and I feel quite strongly about many of these things, and I would like to think most people agree with me, and they might not. I just don't think you should ever invoke the silent majority in order to make that case. Talk about the silent majority to talk about the dead. I quite like that. The reason I like it is it reminds us that actually all of the agitation of the here and now is nothing in the broadest perspective. But the from Nixon to Trump you've really made it clear this is not just on the right. So this is actually quite a ecumenical term, and it can be used and abused in lots of different ways. Nonetheless, those two politicians seem to me to frame an era where it has been mobilized and weaponized effectively. But I hope we've tried to show it's actually not a coherent position. It doesn't do democracy any good. For people who've asked, we are going to be coming back to the great political films. We've reached 1966, so there is a long way to go, and we've got a lot more films and a lot more interesting people to talk to. And a reminder that there is a bonus episode, me in conversation with Helen Thompson about Apocalypse Now, which is available on PPF Plus. Also a reminder, if you would like to give PPF Plus as a gift, we have a special Christmas package that includes a copy of my book, The History of Ideas, but you can give PPF Plus as a gift anyway. 6 months as well as a year. Just go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. Coming up next in the history of bad ideas, I'm going to be talking to the geneticist and award-winning science writer, Adam Rutherford, about what's wrong with Nobel Prizes. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.